informative and interesting, and I don't think anybody will come away feeling like we jumped the shark, which may have happened a few times recently. I mean, even the Fonz wasn't perfect. And with that said, let's loiter at that curious crossroads between Magic Lane and Parapolitics Avenue with a guy who knows those streets oh too well, Gordon White. Alright people, we know the world is a lot weirder than the news network's narrative, the school system's sedation, and the matrix of mediocrity that has been carefully conjured around our collective consciousness. But tongue twisters aside, today we're going to examine that weird reality, look into some hidden history, and put magic back under the microscope to see which parts of it might be useful in our own lives, how the elite have used it, and to help us break free of the prison bars around our brains. And to do that, we got chaos magician and witty writer Gordon White, who resides in London and has been talking about these things and many others on his amazing blog at runesoup.com. Gordon is another guest suggestion from the fine folks over at THC Plus, and after I read some of his Arcanology series, I knew it would be a good fit. So let's do the damn thing. Gordon, my man, welcome to THC. How the hell are you?
I'm great, and it's a pleasure to be here. As you know, Greg, I'm a THC Plus member myself, and I love the show.
Yes, and thanks so much for that. You might actually be the first Plus subscriber to also be a guest. I couldn't think of a better person for that. This should be a lot of fun. I do love your work too. Your writing is just full of little lines that perfectly summarize things I can never seem to get out very fluidly, and it covers a lot of ground too. Magic, Gnosticism, Archons, crimes of the elite, and all sorts of high strangeness. It's definitely right up my alley, and I'm sure we're going to jump all over the place. But I did want to kind of try to start from this era of Gnosticism and this time when magic wasn't so weird. The concept of the Archons has come up a lot. It's a popular idea, so we should know more about where it came from, but this era is very confusing to me. There's so much that's been lost, so much that's been twisted, and one of your great lines that talks about this is when you say that the story of the past changes with every present. And that's just so well said, and it really explains why it's so hard to get to the truth of anything, especially an era that's so old. But what would you say are the important things that people should know about the Gnostics?
Well, the Gnostics have almost a double or triple dose of that changed past situation, because for about 1,500 years, all we really knew about them was written by their detractors. It was written by a guy called Irenaeus in sort of about 180, and he was actually the first person to ever mention the four canonical Gospels, Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John. So before that, the whole of Christianity was in this weird, confusing Mediterranean mess. Now, this is sort of like asking Fox News what's going on in Syria.
Right.
Because he is a competitor. He's not a fan of the Gnostics. And so even at the descriptor, we're talking about a very broad church of a lot of really weird, but good weird, people and practices and groups that spread out across the Mediterranean that had combined Hellenism and Judaism and early Christianity and Egyptian magic, and were all putting it together in this sort of umbrella goal or umbrella belief that obviously Gnosticism comes from the word gnosis, which means knowledge. And in this case, it means personal knowledge. It's the idea that you can have that direct, unmediated experience of the divine. Mm-hmm. And so we sort of only vaguely knew what these people were like from their detractors until maybe the mid-20th century, and we discover the Nag Hammadi library and start to see some of the texts and match it to some of the groups and very mean-spirited sayings of their detractors around the time. So there's a number of reasons why drawing a bead on Gnosticism is extremely difficult, and in fact, many PhDs have tried and failed.
Then I don't feel quite as dumb.
Yeah.
So you might have been quoting someone else when you said this, but I've heard you say that the Archon story almost reads like Jesus fan fiction, and I thought that was a great way to put it, and I see why someone would say that, but it is that interconnection between Christianity and Gnosticism that's sort of confusing to me, because I almost feel like they're opposites. I guess, can you clarify that at all?
Sure. I will tell you that was a quote from Chris Knowles of The Secret Sun, which is my favorite blog. He was referring to Gnosticism being, if you read the text, and it's true, if you look at something like the Gospel of Mary, it looks like these groups are writing Jesus fan fiction. And he meant that in a positive way, because obviously his background and interest is in superheroes and their relationship to gods and the unconsciousness and all that kind of stuff. His book is called Our Gods Wear Spandex, and it's excellent. what he meant by that is, well, I guess you have to back it up. We have this default view, and it's historically wrong, that there was a guy called Jesus. The default view, even if you're atheist, is all the stuff about walking on water and loaves and fishes is balderdash. But there was obviously this guy wandering around Jerusalem. Now, that's not good history. You're basically just removing the bits you don't like and leaving the bits that you find acceptable, even though they both have zero evidence. Now, what we're experiencing in, shall we say, Bible studies or biblical archaeology is the same thing that happened to Moses in the 70s. In the 70s, people started to realize Moses never really existed. Like you have Manu, you have Menes, you have all these lawgiver types that existed prior to Moses in the story. I mean, there's no parting of the Red Sea. There was no great chunk of Jewish slaves in Egypt. There were plenty of Jews in Egypt, but none of these things happened. And so you had this kind of tentative put their head above the parapet and say, I don't think this happened. And that was quite radical because obviously biblical archaeology was the sort of province of retired Church of England vicars and really quite Bible-thumping sort of Southern state American Christian groups that would fly over to Israel and dig up stuff and say, look, I found the Palace of Solomon. So you're dealing with 150 years of academia that has a vested interest in a particular version of the story. Mm-hmm. Now, that version of the story is that Jesus existed. And there's like zero evidence at all that ever happened. And every piece of his life is foreshadowed in previous myths. Now, this is fine because if you look at the groups, I mean, you get, this is really quite popular amongst atheist groups at the moment, like, hooray, Jesus doesn't exist, that equals there is no God. Now, that's a really bad cognitive jump because when I encountered this material, I thought the opposite. My problem with Jesus was always that the stories were not correct. Like, this is just garbage. These things physically happen. Now, what appears to be the case is that at the time you had people like Philo of Alexandria talking about the logos, which is a Greek idea of the word or this animating force from the divine that kind of, by encountering or experiencing that, you redeem yourself and you redeem the world. And you start to see all these pieces that fall into the kind of Jesus narrative later. So these Gnostic groups were, I think they would have been quite alarmed when people came over from, let's say Rome or, Italy or the Roman, North Mediterranean Roman province and said, so this Jesus guy, where did he live? And they'd be like, I'm sorry, what? Where did Superman live? You're talking about things that can't exist on the physical plane. And when you realize that, a lot of bizarre pieces of the Gospels make sense. The Gospel of Mary, which I mentioned before, is actually one of my favorite Gospel texts. And they're all sitting in this room, and I think it's Peter, it might have been Paul, but sort of says to Mary, why is Jesus talking to you? And she bursts into tears, and it's basically like, do you think I made this up? Do you think I'm just inventing the Son of God talking to me in my head? And you go, well, that's really weird. Why don't they just ask him? Is he in the room with him if he's talking to Mary? And then you suddenly think, hang on, I'm reading the transcript of a seance.
Right.
And when you hear Jesus say, whenever there are 2 and 3 gathered in my name, I am there, seance. Not an actual seance like they're summoning a dead person, but what you're seeing here is the filtering through of the idea that Jesus is a concept. And I mean that they literally believed in him, but they didn't believe he existed in the physical world. You see it sort of accidentally filtering through these texts, and then you get the inevitable conflating down for imperial Roman political reasons of a definitive story that they can lock down and control. And that's been the one that we've decided was actual history, and that's really spun us for a loop for quite some time, 50, 60 years. And that's the other reason why getting a bead on Gnosticism is like, well, so what is Jesus is in some kind of spaceship in this one, and he's talking through a cave, and now he's in a shipwreck, and you go, what's happening here? And it's because of that idea, particularly for the Gnostics, because the material realm was not, well, it was divine, but it wasn't perfect. Jesus physically couldn't exist in the physical realm because it's the production of the demiurge. It's created by a false god, and if he's perfect, he can't be down here. So he exists in this realm that you need to contact him, and you get that redemption or rebirth through the Son, the Logos, this Jesus figure. And there you have the kind of, I would say, 80% of the reason why it's so confusing when you get when you encounter Gnosticism through parapolitics, where it's so confusing to get your head around, well, where are these terms that are coming at me from, like archon and like demiurge, because I'm all at sea with it. And that's largely why you're talking about a really an exciting but very chaotic soup of different ideas encountering each other and mixing in a time of quite significant economic and social change.
You're right, man. It is super tough, but wow, you really got me with those seance examples. That really explains why we see this mixing of magic and early Christianity and why the Gospels are so weird. At least it makes a lot of sense to me, because I had kind of been thinking that the two really just clashed. Because didn't Gnosticism predate Christianity? And I guess we can say that none of them really saw Jesus as a real person, which I wasn't sure about, but I guess you're saying that all came later with the Romans, right?
Literally all came later. But to go back to your question, because I think it's very important as to is Gnosticism pre-Christian, the short answer is yes, but not by much. I would characterize it as Jew-Egyptian. You had in, say, after the destruction of the Second Temple, actually before it, frankly, but in that end of the Second Temple destruction period, you had a widespread dissatisfaction with the Jewish elite. You had the sort of people associated with the temple and the highborn families getting land grants from the Flavian, so the imperial royal family, getting land grants. So the guy who founded rabbinical Judaism got given this great chunk of Mediterranean land by the emperor, and then he sets up this version of Judaism which kind of works with what the empire wants. And you have this, we think of these kind of hijacks. We think of the negative things the Catholic Church has done, or the hijack of, say, the federal government. But it happened to the Jews as well. It happened to the Jews several centuries before it happened to anyone else. So you're starting to have this idea, and I'll come back to how I can tie those two together. So you have a lot of widespread dissatisfaction, particularly in Alexandria. What I didn't know until a few months ago, maybe a year ago, was that Alexandria was actually the most Jewish city outside of Israel. In the Mediterranean, possibly up to 30% of the population was Jewish. So you have the Egyptians and the Jews and the Greeks and all these people mixing together. Now, if you look at, say, the Setians, which are a sect of Gnostics, and they're probably the most popular ones, like when you talk about archons in a parapolitical sense, you're really talking about how the Setians saw the world. And they were either thought of themselves as descendants of Set or Seth, or that Jesus was sort of an emanation of Seth, because you can discern in their scriptures, so the Apocryphon of John, for instance, that they were deeply unimpressed with temple Judaism. Their demiurge, so the evil god that created the world, is called Yaldabaoth, which is very close to Yahweh. And you start to see, and also if they think they're descended from Seth, what they're doing is distancing themselves from this sort of Davidic elite mess up. And so as a result, you have, and in fact, one of them, a guy I mentioned earlier, Philo of Alexandria, was from probably the richest family that wasn't royal in the Mediterranean at the time. He traveled, and this is one of the proofs why I think there was no Jesus, and I think I'm pretty good with it. No, not on a physical realm. He was actually in Jerusalem at the time where Jesus was supposed to be doing things like having everyone hail him as their king and encircling the town with a wall and all these things that should appear in the archaeological record, you would think. But he had this idea. He introduced that Hellenic idea of the logos, or logos as the word, into his kind of esoteric Judaism. So there was an esoteric Judaism that picked up Hellenistic ideas and Egyptian ideas. And it's a question of, does Gnosticism predate Christianity, or do we pull Christianity back earlier than the kind of arbitrary dates of 0 BC to 33 AD, because those events didn't happen? Because you have people at 70 AD, give or take, talking about this logos and how it can redeem you, and it's the Son of God that redeems the world. So is that Christianity?
Right. Yeah, it's so confusing.
Well, it's a mangrove swamp, so it's where it's half land and it's half water, and it's really fertile, and all these different ideas are bouncing around, and that's great, and it's also a prime opportunity for a hijack, which is what inevitably happened. Mm-hmm. So yeah, Gnosticism predates Christianity I would say definitively, because if we date it from 33 AD, for instance, I mean, we shouldn't. The earliest mention, gospel-wise, is 94 AD. So even these supposed eyewitnesses are one lifetime away from the events that they were describing. And they're terrible at it. Like the gospel descriptions, the gospel's all written in Greek, can mention taverns in Rome by name, but describe Palestinian geography like they heard about it on the radio in Japan. Like everything is wrong. This, you can start to, again, triangulate where the official story is emanating from, and it's Rome, obviously.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and you mentioned that the Jewish faith underwent the earliest manipulation of this stuff.
I would say that, yeah.
Right. We don't know what the earliest was.
No, exactly.
But an earlier one than Christianity. And do you think that has anything to do with why so many people today see the Jews as the highest elite?
No, I think that's unfortunate and much more recent. And by much more recent, I mean from sort of 500 AD. The description, you can tell how the Gospels get quite anti-Semitic. So the earliest ones, the earliest one is Mark, and he's the one who can name taverns in Rome and can't get geography right. He mentions the destruction of the temple, which happens in 70 AD. So right away, you're talking about someone who wasn't there. But Jesus goes from being a Jew to, by the time you get to Paul, which isn't the gospel, but by the time you get to, say, his letters, they're referring to the Jews as this separate group. And hang on, and obviously quite disparagingly as well. Like that's where you start to see, like, oh well, the Jews let their Messiah get killed, and blah blah blah. Anything? It's a very odd thing for a Jewish text to start getting anti-Semitic towards. Right. So you can see there the attempts at controlling an imperial province, or at least influencing how it sees the world. There's a great book and a great series of books by a guy called Joseph Atwill about Caesar's Messiah, and he sort of tracks the Flavian imperial project through the Holy Land and lines up Jesus' ministry with the Titus's imperial military campaigns. So, and they're all there. Like Titus was the one that encircled Jerusalem with the wall. He did the abomination of desolation, like all these things. And the idea is that they were writing these books about something that happened 50 years before Titus got there to foreshadow Titus's arrival. So, oh look, it's the second coming. It's the Jews' Messiah, and it turns out to be the Emperor of Rome. Israel was a really difficult province for the Romans because the emperor would show up in Egypt and spend the night in a temple and say, "The god Serapis has come to me. I am his son." And everyone's like, whatever, and they go on with their gods and stuff. The Jews were having none of that. Like, we have our God, you want him, and you want the Messiah. And so you had to have a different way of inserting, we would say propaganda. You had to have a different way of inserting imperial propaganda into that particular province. And that's his thesis. And I think there's a lot to say for that. I think it's all the earliest Catholic saints are members of the Flavian royal family, for instance. There's just, and the author that Christian apologists will use to say Jesus existed is a guy called Josephus, but his full name is Flavius Josephus, and he was adopted by the empire and became his chief propagandist and all this. So it's very murky. It's there is nothing new in the world. Hijacks happen.
God, man, we're not even a half hour into this thing and my head's already spinning, but in a good way, really. It's just that I've never heard much of these angles before, so it gets a little tangled with preconceived notions. Like here's one. It seems like, at least in the conspiracy world, when people talk about Gnostics, they're putting out this idea that the God of the three major religions, this Yahweh demiurge entity, this being that created the earth, is actually a negative entity, and that dark members of the elite have created these mind control religions where they've told everyone that they're really worshiping a peaceful, loving God. But that's just not the case. And this also would dovetail into why there's so much pedophilia and corruption and ritual sacrifice among the elites, or at least in rumors. And I think that story sounds good, but I don't really know how much truth there is to it. Do you put much stock in that storyline, or is it off in some way?
Yeah, I don't. I think that we might call that, say, like the David Icke view of modern Gnosticism.
Yeah, fair.
And I mean, I've written about him on the blog. I don't have a problem with him. I see him as part of a continuum of very odd British mystics. Like America creates Tom Cruise, and we create David Icke, and he lives in a shitty seaside town. And it's cultures throw up odd mystics, and I respect him for that. It's sort of like he had some kind of profound experience in South America, like a Whitley Strieber-esque life-changing incident, and now he's gone chasing after lizards and pedophiles because that's what happens when you encounter spirit. Something really worldview or paradigm shifting happens. But no, I don't. The evidence for a continuity of that, one, isn't there. One, it's absent. But two, it relies on a failure to understand what Yahweh was, and also that kind of. I just get this weird feeling. Say this Brotherhood of Saturn thing, I think, is the new way of saying the Jews. Because they always go back to, oh, well, look, Yahweh is Saturn, so the Jews are secretly worshipping this horned, beardy god of death. Now, that's really bad magic. Yahweh is certainly associated with Saturn, the Sabbath being Saturday, Saturn Day. But Yahweh is associated with Saturn for very specific mystical and astrological reasons. If you think about the worldview of astrology, where the world is in the middle because it doesn't go anywhere, and you have your sun, you have your moon and your sun, and then Mercury and then Venus, and then the furthest one out of the astrological system is Saturn. So it's the slowest moving planet in astrology, and beyond that is the sort of supernal realms. That's where God lives, and everything from Saturn down is the manifest world. So there's no evil death cult that the Jews have perpetrated through the century. Like that is a people will come to those conclusions if they're either A, anti-Semitic, or B, don't understand magic. And in a lot of cases, I think maybe A and B both apply. So we need to detach those ideas from it. Each time this happens, and this is what I mean by there's nothing new, each time it happens, and this is why I think Gnosticism is so valuable even as a metaphor, you have this awareness that the people who are in control of the world aren't running it for you, never will, don't have your best interests at heart, and are probably not very good. You experience that with the Gnostic rejection of Second Temple Judaism and Roman Christianity and the rest of it. We're experiencing it now because we are experiencing it. We're experiencing an imperial control mechanism, and we are looking for the right metaphor for how that can exist in a universe that, say, listeners to the show will be aware the story doesn't begin and end with materialism. So it's like, how am I reconciling the presence of this power and its malicious intent with a universe that I can occasionally, and hopefully more with an increasing level of encounters, experience as quite wonderful? And out of that, you sort of get this, I think it's really useful. Out of that, you sort of get this Gnostic worldview. There's a famous, which one's it in? It's from The Hypostasis of the Archons, or The Reality of the Rulers. But what happened was God, the perfect God, so in Pleroma, was sort of creating these emanations. And they got to one called Sophia, and then Sophia had a child called Samael. And Samael created the material universe in a echo of that first instance of pure creation. And this is how you can kind of tell that they're really talking about the temporal elite God. Because he says, it is I who am God, there is none apart from me. And the words in it say, when he said this, he sinned against the entirety. So the entirety is, and he sinned against the entire universe by saying that. And a voice came from above him, and it said, you are mistaken, Samael. And Samael is the blind God. Like it comes from the Hebrew word for blind. And that is the demiurge in, say, maybe in a third to 40% of Gnostic cases. So, and that's kind of, I like that as a metaphor. It describes reality quite well. It may or may not be true, but it provides a framework. In particular, once after that, Samael creates the Archons in mimicry of the sort of true God creating eons or emanations. Archon as a Greek word actually just means like boss. It was actually a political office, so it's someone who's in charge. It doesn't necessarily mean. It doesn't have to be negative. In fact, you find Gnostic gemstones that have St. Michael described as an archon. Well, not saint by then, but it's Michael the Archangel described as an archon because that word means someone who's powerful and a boss and in charge. So the idea that they are interdimensional lizards beaming to Earth slingshotting via the moon from Saturn because they're jealous of our creative capacities is not well corroborated.
Right, that's fair to say.
But that's where I took the term from, because there's almost an ambivalence to the power. They're not. I don't think. Well, basically, if they're trying to depopulate the planet, they're doing a really bad job of it. So this idea that there's some kind of bloodthirsty monster eating us is, again, not well corroborated. Nevertheless, I think their agenda is not aligned with the best interests of the planet.
Yeah, well said. I would say definitely not. Now let me ask you, do you think the planet's elite are using magic? Because like you said, everyone's trying to figure this out, and the Brotherhood of Saturn does come up a lot. And to your first point about being anti-Semitic, of course, I'm not. I have no inner desire to find any particular group responsible. I just want to find out who is responsible, whoever that is. But to the second point about understanding magic, yeah, I really don't understand it that well. I don't think very many people do, but I found that interesting. So let me ask you what kind of insights your practice and understanding of magic give you into how the elite might be using it, or what they might be communicating with up there, if anything.
That's a really good question. I have a definition of magic that I use for people that who listen to the show, who are interested in this kind of stuff, that isn't a Crowleyan one about true will and blah, blah, blah. It is, magic is, and I'll explain my explanation afterwards because it sort of sounds a bit douchey to start with.
Okay.
But magic is a culture-specific response to naturally occurring consciousness effects like telepathy and precognition and all these things that as humans with a normal functioning mind we experience. Now, to break that down, if you look from Australian Aboriginal tribes to chaos magicians in 2015 London, the quote-unquote powers or the quote-unquote effects that you can achieve with magic pretty much boil down to the same 4 or 5 things. Telepathy, precognition, so seeing the future, so clairvoyance, whatever you want to call it, visiting the other world, and in some way trafficking with the spirits. Everything else sort of tumbles out of that in detail. You find those 4 characteristics amongst shamans in the Amazon, and you will find them amongst Palos in California. So magic for me is a culture-specific way of taking sovereignty over your own consciousness, which is also a way I think everyone should try it. It's sort of like, it's the birthright of all mankind. So, is there an elite project that involves magic, or are the elite involved with magic in some way? The short answer is yes. The short answer is yes, and we, based on that definition, can layer it. I'm telling you right now, Dick Cheney is not a fucking Thelemite. So this kind of idea that they're all secretly worshipping Moloch, or they're trying to bring about some sort of Thelemic empire. The Patriot Act is the opposite of Thelema. So, it's the actual opposite. If they're Thelemites, they're terrible at it. Again, the thing is, magicians don't understand parapolitics, and I think it's very important because it's how power acts in the world. And we should be interested in that. Historically, we have been. And people involved in parapolitics don't have much exposure to magic either. So there is this kind of necessity for kind of looking over the fence. Why I think, let me give several examples. At a base level, you can definitively prove that they're using magic because you have a sort of 60-year manipulation of media. And in media, it's the same thing as the Flavians did in the, Judean provinces. They're using media to change people's consciousness in a way that suits their own agenda. And we have that. We have Mockingbird. We have literally anything that you can see on television. So is that magic? I would say yes, that is. Is it magic in the fucking cool, we've got a pentagram somewhere and we're summoning Azrael kind of thing? No, it's not. But there is quite a decent amount of evidence that pieces of that, and hundreds and hundreds of pieces of that, have been incorporated into the shadow state that then became the private state. And I have a blog post called Billionaires in Astrology, and it's about elite belief systems, and it's sort of, because the old saying is millionaires don't believe in astrology, billionaires do. And it's sort of looking at the behavior of, and I just took the Rockefellers because they're the sort of more prominent or most prominent elite family that we have access to, but it's also one that has, in Lawrence Rockefeller's case, has had a bunch of really weird interests. So in the late 90s, he funded Colin Andrews, the famous crop circle researcher, for I think it was almost 2 years. He put money into Esalen. Esalen was a Rockefeller project. He probably funded some of Sitchin's research. So this is one of the richest and most powerful men on earth. And I'm just talking from the 70s to 2000. He's giving money to a guy who thinks the Sumerian gods are aliens who arrived on nuclear-powered rocket ships to mine our gold to save their atmosphere.
Mm-hmm.
And then he's looking into crop circles. But then you wind back the Rockefeller project. So in between the war, they're funding eugenics, obviously. They paid for 2 floors of the Kaiser Wilhelm Institute's eugenics project before the Nazis. They're obviously involved in Standard Oil and all the kind of IG Farben stuff that comes out immediately after the war. They fund family planning. The Rockefellers put money into the Smithsonian, which obviously I think pulled in a lot of the giant bones and shit that happened in America. So if you look over the let's even say 80 years of the 20th century, it becomes apparent that, well, he's dead now, but it becomes apparent that Lawrence Rockefeller has a view of the world that does not match yours or mine.
Right.
Crop circles, genetics, Sitchin, all these pieces. Oh, and obviously extreme involvement in the shadow state and the kind of black projects that came out of World War II. So he's got access. He's got visibility over these things that we don't. And by the end of the 90s, he's paying someone to look for crop circles. So by the time you get to and he was in his 90s, by the time you get to the end of the millennium, he's willing to put his own money into someone looking at crop circles. Rich people don't tend to do that, give away money, unless there is something potentially in it for them at the other end. There is unquestionably a belief system at the 0.00001% that does not in any way match what we think is going on. And falling out of that is potentially maybe not magical practices, maybe just personal beliefs. I think once you get to the use of magic in a shadow state capacity, you sort of jump down 20 rungs to the CIA and the Collins elite and MK Ultra and Operation Often and all these things that we can go into, because you sort of have immediately after the war a whole bunch of money going into solving some really weird things that had happened. Principal among them, of course, was the UFO phenomenon, whatever that happened to be. I don't know if you read Nick Redfern's book about the Collins elite, Final Events.
Final Events. No, that might be one of the ones I haven't read, but I believe he talks about the Collins elite also in a little bit in one of the later ones, like For Nobody's Eyes Only. Yes, I talked to him about it then. Yeah,
it's those 2 books. If anyone's interested in ufology and where the shadow state overlaps with magic, those 2 books are quite important, because with the Collins elite, you see information that in that kind of Roswell, Wright-Patterson world, the FBI had an awareness of Jack Parsons and Aleister Crowley and their involvement, and they weren't quite sure if Parsons' experiments didn't have anything to do with Roswell, and they knew that there was some kind of magic UFO connection. So these flyboys, which I find hilarious, these sort of Protestant flyboys, ended up with a very Jacques Vallée view of what these phenomena are long before Jacques Vallée. Actually, he was sort of involved about 12 years later. So we're already seeing that with the ufology thing immediately after the war, you have the nuts and bolts explanation, which I would say is 100% Cold War propaganda. But then underneath it, you have a whole bunch of groups who start doing things like the CIA was paying for astrologers. The CIA was publishing articles on how to use the Ouija board to debrief dead assets and dead agents. So in this kind of 50 to pretty much the church inquiry, there is money going everywhere to this combination of spooks and magic and ufology, or phenomenology, which is a word I obviously prefer for it. Couple of conclusions we can draw from that is that no one had a full picture. So there wasn't like oh, look, we got a spacecraft, let's put it underground and reverse engineer it, and now we have this secret thing and no one else knows about it. There's not a linear process. What you're seeing there is people with unlimited money finding out pieces of a puzzle and attempting, obviously, to weaponize them and see where they correlate. And that's obviously the other half of MK Ultra, was if you can do mind control, is mind control related to this phenomenology? Because obviously Crowley summoned Lamb and all that, like the stuff that was going on, doesn't it all match a nuts and bolts view of the world? And so, yes, I do think quite frankly. I mean, does drugging entire populations count as magic? Do all these, I think they do. And I think someone somewhere before, whatever it was, 1 million documents were shredded about the MK Ultra project so that they could go to the church committee and say it never worked. Then why did you shred the fucking document? Because by then you have the Stargate project, which had money from Werner von Braun himself, so an SS major who founded NASA, put money into the early Russell Targ experiments. So there are pieces that we will never be able to connect in a satisfactory way because too much time has passed and too much is redacted. But you see these constellation of pieces that if you kind of look at from the corner of your eye, you can discern that there is unquestionably a belief system at the top and a practical application of a, shall we say, magical belief system running through the machinations of the shadow state.
Huh. Yeah, I've never really heard those projects connected, and thinking about the underlying belief structure beneath them, that is interesting and it makes sense. I did want to jump back to your definition of magic being a cultural overlay to phenomenon that would normally occur in a well-functioning mind, and ask you, since telepathy and precognition and these things don't seem to occur all that often to the majority, does that imply that part of the elite's agenda is to keep the minds at large from experiencing these things?
I would split that into two questions and say yes to both of them. I mean, 93% of people I think that was in the Sheldrake book, will say, oh yes, I've experienced telepathy, oh, my phone's going to ring and it's going to be Greg, and then there goes my phone and it's Greg. Those kind of consciousness effects don't exist in a world where we're meat robots. And so everyone experiences them, just as we experience individuality and consciousness and things that hilariously people will get on stage with their individual consciousness and say doesn't exist. So part of it is, when I say it's the birthright of all mankind and it's naturally occurring, I mean, seriously, it's kind of like writing or sex or something. Everyone can do it. Some people are better at it, and you get better at it with practice. But magic is you kind of becoming aware that either, whatever description you want, but the universe runs on a consciousness or spirit model. And then what you do with that, what steps you take. It's well, okay, then I'm going to do some sigil magic, or I'm going to learn the tarot, or I'm going to do whatever because I'm taking control of the parts of my participation that I can take control of. I think things like SSRIs, whether intentionally or not, certainly different foodstuffs, and again, whether it's intentionally or not, electromagnetic radiation, all the kind of pollutions that we experience in the modern world absolutely disrupt a kind of coherent and wider experience of consciousness. If you've ever been out in the desert under the stars at night, no light pollution, nothing else around, the entire experience of reality is different. And then you come back to the city or you come back to wherever, and it's almost like that memory of that experience or that contact fades, and you go, well, what was that? I was stoned, but I wasn't that stoned.
Yeah.
And so whether by design or not, and this is where Gnosticism kind of works as a metaphor, the material world is a trap for our consciousness, and we need to become aware of that, and becoming aware of it is sort of 80% of the step to taking as much control of that situation as we can.
I do like that. I think a lot of people who are talking about Gnosticism, whether it's David Icke or even Graham Hancock now talks about it a lot, they do talk about it in that literal sense, and maybe it should just be thought of as more metaphorically, because it's just so much manipulation went on back then. I can't really take anything from that era and be like, okay, this is the gospel truth. This is now my worldview in 2015.
Yeah, absolutely. I wouldn't take it as gospel truth. Here's the thing. How good does a metaphor have to get describing reality before we decide it isn't a metaphor and it's true? So Gnosticism is either a metaphor for reality, or it describes reality, or it is reality. Either way, your kind of next steps are the same. Treat it as a metaphor and become aware of your divine spark and do something with it, and be aware that there is no physical realm utopia. There aren't enough marches in the world. Can you imagine how, you think you're going to march on Washington and say, we want the truth about 9/11, and then the president's going to come and go, oopsie, you got us. Like that, it doesn't happen. they will always, like Grant Morrison says, the empire never ended. You kind of have an inter-control mechanism period, and we're about coming up to one of them.
Yeah, elections.
But there's a control mechanism. The battle for freedom isn't won on a macro level. It's won on millions and millions and millions of individual levels. And so that's effectively Gnosticism. So is it a metaphor, or is it actually describing reality?
Yeah, great point. I guess it really doesn't matter. We're kind of splitting hairs.
Well, that's the chaos magic approach, is that hyper-pragmatic, is this going to work or not? And its sort of external truth claims are less relevant than whether it works.
Mm-hmm. And I do like that approach. It's sometimes hard for me to talk about. It's not a super natural type of thought process for me, but I guess that's why I find it exciting. Being someone who practices magic, I have to ask you about Aleister Crowley. We did talk about him a little bit off the air, and as you know, I've got guests who in the past have condemned him and say that the elite are trying to usher in the age of Horus using all these tools of Crowley to descend society into a hedonistic mess, and then others say that the negative stuff is just propaganda from Christians and people who want to be afraid of magic. And I can see both being true, but I really don't know. What do you think of Crowley?
I'm a big fan, frankly. I'm not a Thelemite. I listened to your interview with David, and we have people in common, and I know a bunch of people in the OTO. It's when you ask someone from the OTO rather than, say, a rogue Thelemite about Crowley, you get a very high church answer, obviously. And I'm not a Thelemite at all. I view Crowley in a wider continuum, almost like David Icke. Crowley was probably, I'm struggling to think of another example, except a guy, I still think that. Crowley was probably the best magician the West produced in the last several centuries. He was a fascinating and complex man. He was a part-time spook, or occasionally a spook. He climbed mountains. He had all these mystical experiences, and he did the same thing we all try to do, which is integrate those experiences or realizations as a result of different encounters into a cohesive worldview. So as for the elites trying to usher in the Eon of Horus, one, no. And two, if the Book of the Law describes reality, they couldn't anyway. An eon moves. An eon moves regardless of what petty humans want to do. So they can't usher it in. It probably is happening. It's actually quite a good description of the 20th century, given that it was received in 1906. If you look at the third chapter or book of the Book of the Law, the war and the fire god stuff and whatever, it doesn't suck as far as descriptions of the 20th century go. So if there is an Eon of Horus, we're in it. But I love him. I think he's a hobby. It's almost like, tell you what it is, it's like Shakespeare, because it's a long time ago, and it's a brilliant writer and an enigmatic man, and you kind of pick new stuff up each time because he's working on levels you don't know, and then you get a piece of his life and you plug it in to what he was writing, and it all comes together. But there's a lot to it.
Yeah, I mean, I have to ask people who are into magic about Crowley. There's just so many different opinions, and I like to gather them all and then kind of see in the ether what kind of forms. And I guess he doesn't seem like a terrible guy. It seems like misunderstood. He just seems like a lot of the weirder aspects of his exploration of magic don't necessarily seem evil or negative. They just seem kind of neutral and strange.
Yeah, there was certainly that. I mean, he was an absolute product of his time, and everyone makes a load about the fact that his mother called him the Beast. You're the Beast, Alex, growing up. What you actually need to see is someone who went to college to study classics, fell in love with a male cross-dressing performer, wrote poetry for them, rode across China, climbed mountains, as I said, was a spy, took a girl band to Russia. There's a lot of stuff about him that makes him highly unique. I mean, you're sort of talking about not David Bowie, but there is something where you go, normal people don't behave that way, and that's what makes you an amazing artist and probably an amazing magician. Yeah, and as a result, I find him eternally fascinating, and I will hear bad words about him, but I won't hear a definitive bad word in the sense that, he's not worth your time. That's absolutely not the case.
Yeah, the man lived, and he was definitely an adventurer and wasn't all that concerned about the judgments. I wanted to talk about one of the pieces that you wrote called The Seance That Changed America. It's kind of on the subject of the elite and magic and kind of dabbling a little bit. And it fits in nicely with this wheelhouse of the elites and spirits. Can you tell the people a little bit about that? What happened there?
That was a seance that happened in a New England farmhouse on New Year's Eve, and gathered at it was a fascinating man, Andrija Puharic, and his sort of Indian channel, or the guy who would be conducting the seance, and basically scions of America's richest families. You had a Forbes there, you had Arthur Bell of Bell Labs, you had Payne, you had a Vanderbilt. You basically had like the blue blood, East Coast blue blood anyway, which was the blue blood of America at the time, sitting around having this seance. And they contacted a being, so there's 9 of them, and they contacted a single being initially that referred to itself as the 9, and it was the Ennead, or the 9 Egyptian gods, in a kind of invisible spaceship orbiting the Earth. And this is quite transformative. So the people who were at this event then went on to do things in the space program, in Hollywood, at an elite funding level for different projects of any kind. I mean, you're talking about, what would that be, 30% of the available capital in the Northeast at the time, sitting in that room, or at least had access to it.
Yeah.
And this, one of the threads you can follow is when it got to California in the 60s, Gene Roddenberry, for instance, one of his first jobs when he got to California was to write a script for this cult that was based on the 9. And the 9 have showed up in a whole bunch of different channeled cults, some of which may be MK Ultra plots, most of which probably aren't. And he was actually fired from that because the script was too realistic. But what you have in the case of Andrija Puharic and Arthur Bell, you have an overlap there with MK Ultra and experiments in mushrooms and how they can be weaponized or used for truth serum, because Andrija Puharic. Oh, and also you have an overlap with the Stargate program, which included people who were then being unofficially being paid to remote view bases on the backside of the moon. So you have again this constellation or overlap problem where making direct connections will probably leave too much data on the table. And the better step is to look and go, well, hang on. So Andrija Puharic is working out of Fort Meade at the same time as Walter Dornberger was there with stuff that he got from Roswell. This is all true. Well, not Roswell, right? Patterson Air Force Base. And he went to Bell Labs. Then he and Arthur Bell went gallivanting around Mexico looking for mushrooms on the CIA's dime. He brought Uri Geller to America. Uri Geller was obviously a Mossad spy. And Andrija Puharic was probably his handler. So you have all these pieces where, again, coming back to that, is there a system of magic in the shadow state? The short answer is yes, and this is a very interesting through line where you start to think, well, where are these findings and experiences going, and what do they look like once they cohere? Because I'll tell you something about the quote unquote UFO problem or challenge or what have you. Or conceptualizing it. It's something Richard Dolan mentions a few times. He had one of his sources who was an aide to Jimmy Carter tell a story. And it was a story of he walked into the Oval Office immediately after Carter had the quote-unquote, the briefing. And he was slumped and crying. Now, by the late 70s, when you've had Roswell, whatever that was, and you've had the 9 and MK Ultra and LSD experiments and channeling and whatever kind of and the Brookings report, being aware that there's stuff on other planets and all these pieces. What do they look like if you're the person that has to cohere that into a worldview? And it kind of comes back to the Rockefeller thing. If the president is slumped over in like tears, the picture isn't very good. These aren't our space brothers. They're not here to bring us to ascend us into a new level of carbon-free, peace-loving civilization. The story, they might be eating us. Like the story is not going to be great.
Right.
And I actually think that's probably closer to whether or not that describes reality. I actually think if there is a definitive, like, here is our official shadow state policy on the UFO situation, I don't think it's very good. I think it'll have some kind of ancient aliens components of we were built for something we don't know what. There are remains of things all over the solar system. I don't know what happened to them, but it wasn't good. The things we've encountered have been ambivalent. They're not little green men. They're in a dimension that's half a micron from your face. Like, I don't think the story is... I think Catherine Austin Fitts says this, which is like, when we talk about disclosure, we don't actually know. And she uses the example that the situation is grave enough that the CIA, to get funding, the CIA thought the situation was grave enough that selling crack to American children to raise money was the better option.
Right.
And that's true, because they did. And you sort of go, holy shit. So we don't know what it is in this, mostly private now, but like I say, shadow state, but you call it what you want. We don't know what the challenge is that they're trying to solve, because it's very expensive and weird. And I think that, rather than it's the Brotherhood of Saturn and we're coming into this new thelemic eon of Horus, I think all of that is wrong, or it's operating with a map that's missing most of the countries, because it's weird at the top. I mean, you only need to look at those sort of odd Rockefeller behaviors and go, what are you piecing together? And why is it so destructive that it costs this much?
Right, yeah. Well said, man. I'm with you on a lot of that stuff. I love the study of those alphabet agencies, the paramilitary realm, all the experiments they were doing, some of the really far out things that they've tried that I've learned about from Nick Redfern. I guess I'm totally with you that there's a lot of magic going on that level, but I guess when you consider the power pyramid, that rung of the ladder is relatively low. So do you not take this that far as to say that the shadow government at the very top of the pyramid is actually like taking orders from something non-human? You know, that's more of a David Icke type of idea, but whether it be archons or some guests I've had have said Anunnaki or reptilians or whatever, do you think it's not quite that simple at the top?
As a magician, I wouldn't like, my cosmology means I can't rule that out. I can rule out reptilians. I can,
Right.
But the short answer is, even at low levels, I mean, if anyone who's listening thinks, no, maybe I'll give this magic thing a crack, you will, like, it breaks your life. It does that by design. But you will encounter things, and it certainly happened to me, where you encounter people that are ridden by something. So whether they're consciously ridden at the top or not is sort of irrelevant. Like, if there are these hostile beings who either, and let's do this like biology. What would these beings want? I would suggest they feed on fear. I suggest they feed on fear and our negative consciousness reaction to things. So fear and yelling and hate and what have you. So then the goal would be to ride beings, humans, that can trigger as much of that as possible. And so you're talking at a sort of mid-pyramid level of a Cheney. Mm-hmm. And so I don't rule it out. The thing about what I find fascinating looking at parapolitics, and I came at it from a magic perspective, I did not really, I kind of had a come to Jesus moment with parapolitics when I came to London. I'm born and raised Australian, but then did 6 years in New Zealand. And no one in New Zealand is a conspiracy theorist. And I'll tell you why. New Zealand regularly comes equal second or first with some Nordic country or another for the least corrupt country on earth every year. It's at the end of the earth and it's a farm. Nothing happens there, and if it did, it's localized. So you have this sort of view of the universe that people are fundamentally like you and they're good. Conspiracies in 1980s regional Australia are also very localized. It's some real estate agent bribing someone to become a local politician. It's nothing. Actually, Australia kind of has an Area 51, but it was nothing like that. Yeah, when I got to London, the disparity between the newspapers and the actual real world was like nothing I'd ever seen before. And I'd seen quite a bit of the real world. Like, I'm not just talking about their inability to cover the stories of Britain. And I'm like, hang on. And it was encountering power that made me realize that I don't use the C word. My C word is conspiracy. My C word isn't the other C word. Conspiracy is how, I just swap the word out with business. It's how business works. Anyway, the point is, so that was my way of coming back to how do these things all connect? Because if you follow, say, the pharma industry, it's demonic, and there is some serious concerns to do with, well, obviously Ebola, but you pull on that thread and you get engineered viruses and vaccines and all this kind of really eugenic stuff, again, Rockefeller funded, that happened through the 20th century. You put this piece next to the shadow state piece, next to the finance piece, next to the military industrial piece, and next to the media piece. So you sort of have these sort of 5 archons, if you will. And the effects of each one interlock so completely that the drugs you take, or the prescription medication you're given, combined with the reality TV you watch, combined with the diet that you're on, or the food you can afford because of this, combined with the petrochemical fallout from fracking, which is needed because we're in an oil war, and all these, like, the pieces connect in such a way that you keep coming back to Gnosticism as this is a prison for the soul. Now, I'm not convinced, not that I'm saying it can't happen, but I'm not convinced that those pieces connect in the physical realm. Because there are wealthy families in Eurasia and China that are not going to do what the House of Saud and the Bushes and whatever, and the Rothschilds, frankly, want. So I don't think you have at the top people sitting around and going, oh, what shall we do for 2015? War with Russia, and then this, and then, I don't think that's it. I think we can see a Western agenda in play, which is maybe 80% of what's going on. But they don't. Nevertheless, I keep coming back to, well, the net effect on you, Greg, or on me, of these, say, 5 pillars, is that they do interlock. It's not like, oh, well, I guess I'll stop taking this medication and everything will be fine. Well, it kind of doesn't. The system it still kind of compensates for the fact, well, I'll get off my SSRIs. That is a great move. But then something else happens. You go, well, what the hell? And so that's where I kind of wonder if, I don't think at the top there is a space squid in another dimension running things. I do think, again, a magical cosmology allows for there to be non-physical agencies acting in the physical world at a low level, at a high level, for the hell of it, because they want something. And some of them are good. I mean, that's a very Gandalf thing. Some of them are good, some of them aren't. Inevitably, they're ambivalent. I describe them as sort of like sharks. You go and punch a shark in the face, it's going to bite you. Otherwise, they're fine. And that I would never rule it out that at the top there are people who are either in direct communion with these things, consciously or not. But I don't think it's quite as reptilian.
Right on. I mean, that was really well said. I'm with you. I do think it's those interlocking pieces, the way they connect so well, it makes it really appealing to latch onto that idea, but it might be kind of simple.
It also might be right. I mean, here's the thing, they interconnect. And so you either use Gnosticism as your worldview, which means, well, of course it does. That's how reality is constructed. Or you do a kind of full conspiracy. Well, of course it does, because at the top there are reptilians. But in the physical, and I feel like I'm really ragging on David Icke. I must underline that that's actually not the case. And that's, again, the utility of Gnosticism, if used correctly, is you can kind of hold it up to your experience of reality and go, am I going to use this as a metaphor, or is this actually what's happening? Mm-hmm. And I don't have, well, that's not true. Some days I have an answer for that. Some days that answer changes.
That's the chaos nature of it.
Yep.
Yeah, man, I think you're right. And it is sort of arbitrary to speculate about these things. It's a lot of fun for me, but it's not a lot of practical information, like you said. And kind of a side note on this, in your Reddit Ask Me Anything, I'm a huge Reddit fan, and I liked that you did that. A part of it that I really liked that's in line with this is someone had asked you something to the effect of if Yahweh was protecting Israel today. And your response was something like, trying to detail the current state of things is like shuffling furniture on the Titanic, which is already a great response. But then you followed it up with, well, if Yahweh is a massive nuclear arsenal and an undeclared biological weapons program, then yes. And as witty as that is, I also think it's pretty profound because, what are these things? Are they, literal or metaphors? Like, what is Yahweh? It's probably not hovering over Israel, waiting for battle like the final boss of some RPG or the Eye of Sauron. But it did get me thinking about how the spiritual realm can influence the physical reality. Maybe that influence is manifested in the monetary systems of the world. Maybe it's manifested in Israel's powerful weaponry. It is tough to say, but I thought that was a pretty articulate and witty and deep response.
Well, that's very nice. Thank you. I did actually mean it on two levels, which you picked up on, which is no, I don't, because you could tell the question was otherwise going to go down some potentially. I get called an anti-Semite all the time. I'm part freaking Jewish, so at least I'm maybe part anti-Semitic. I don't know, but you could tell like, oh, so apparently that question was maybe going to go in an uncomfortable area or an area that I want to spend the time following up on because it's not correct. Because I mean, Yahweh, if you think of them like Yahweh from memory, is Lord of Hosts. That's what the word means. But if you listen to the sound, Yahweh, and if you think of the, or maybe if you think of the Gnostic god Iao, IAO, you have that same sound. And then if you go further back, so obviously pretty much all Judaic cosmology is a tumble down of Babylonian and Sumerian cosmology because it's the same area and it's overlaid. So you have Ea, as one of the supreme Sumerian gods. So you have Yahweh, Yao, which I always found very interesting when my grandmother was alive because she was Catholic as well, and she'd trundle off to church, and I'm like, say hi to the Sumerian star god from me. So yeah, Yahweh, the thing that is very disappointing about, not very disappointing, the hijack that happened to the Jews took maybe 1,000 years to get over. And that was conflating a really rich and fecund mythological system with all these different angels and spirits. And God not only had a female side, he had a female consort. There are other light beings and all this kind of wonder. Away from the temple, Judaism was a direct inheritor of some of these fascinating concepts that we got from Sumeria and Babylon. And then you had the same thing that happened with Catholicism and the sort of Flavian hijack. It gets squashed into something. It comes out the end. Temple Judaism, they barely have an afterlife. And you go, well, I don't. You go and read Jewish folklore, and not only do they have an afterlife, they're going on spaceships in other dimensions, and and then it took sort of till, let's say, the 11 to 1200s. You get Moses of Leon writing the Kabbalah, and that fecund, creative way of using this particular worldview to experience the world started to come back, and that subsequently influenced magical systems around the world. As to the sort of existential quality of what these beings are, when you get to the top, I don't know. I think because it's very easy. You would have seen the Archaeology of Dragons presentations. Mm-hmm. The bigger they are, it's very easy to dig them up. So you can trace Jesus through about 4 or 5 different gods back, and you can archaeologically do that with Yahweh. You can do that with Isis. You can do that with loads of them, whatever you want. At a smaller level, I start to get very Valean. Not just as a magician, but the sort of broad worldview of a consciousness-based universe allows for there to be beings that are either extra-dimensional or non-physical and composed of consciousness. So encounters with fairies and spirits and angels and that kind of, or UFOs or whatever, because it's a continuum of this sort of similar phenomenon that we see described throughout history since we were ever writing history. I don't ever think these things are either completely non-existent or entirely in our heads. Certainly at a mid-range level, they're not. And I think maybe at the top level, these are concepts that are built for either control or hopefully for your own kind of apotheosis or experience of the divine, so you can vibrate these words. Like that ER sound is obviously a very old and sacred sound for people who are either in any of those tumble-down traditions, Judaism, Christianity, whatever you want. So there's a sound there that you think, well, can I use that as a mantra? What happens if I sit down and either alter my state of consciousness with meditation or other things and just vibrate that sound for 20 minutes or an hour? What happens? Because that's the sound of that God sound has lasted, let me do the maths on that then, 5,500 years so far. It's interesting. I find that interesting. There's a kind of archaeological component to magic that I'm like, okay, I can. The further back I can find things, It's that, do you know what the Lindy, I think it's the Lindy paradox is?
Lindy paradox. No, not familiar.
It's a technological term that means however long something's been around for so far is how long it's going to be around for in the future. So the fork has been around for 4,000 years. It's going to be around for another 4,000 years. The car has only been around for 80. It's only going to be around for another 80. Mobile phones, iPads, what have you. You kind of conflate technology based on its utility, which I think there's quite a bit to that. It's anyway.
That's interesting.
Yeah, and you will struggle to find things that don't fit into it. Because we will obviously have bicycles long after we have cars, because cars are about to become, maybe not in our lifetime, but they're going to become little robot Google pods that we get in, and then they won't even be that. And the cars are actually, these things do in fact go away. But we'll still have bicycles, probably Google branded. Yeah, so you can apply that, I think, to magical or spiritual practices with some interesting results. You don't have to. I don't have a secret religion, and I'm not trying to sell one. But I kind of look at it and go, well, meditation, mantras, these sounds, these things have been around for as far back as we can see.
Man, this has really been an amazing time. I really enjoyed it. I know I tend to corral interviews a certain way, but I actually wanted to open the floor to you just a bit and ask you, among all the weird things in the world and this wild stuff we've talked about, is there any aspect of these things that you want to emphasize, or maybe I might have missed, or anything that you'd like to tell the people that I didn't prompt you for?
I would say, again, referring to my C word, I guess the most important thing is that in this sort of deluge of parapolitical researchers, we need to get better at distinguishing the data from the interpretation. So the Yahweh Saturn thing is an example. Like, to get to the Brotherhood of Saturn from the astrological aspects of Yahweh is bad. The data are there, and you'll find the same thing with the elite symbols used in either corporate media or they're not portals to Satan, and Jay-Z isn't a devotee of Adam Weishaupt, you know. And I think we just need to get better, and this goes for magic as well, to separate the experience, which is real, or the data point, from the interpretation. I know we glob onto views of the world, 9/11, Roswell, UFOs, magic. We glob onto the way of understanding it that we like the best. And I just think we need to, and it's fine to have it. Everyone has a resting belief system, but we need to hold on to that lighter, with like a lighter touch, so that we can incorporate more data points, because eventually we start to have a bigger worldview as a result.
Well said, man. I think you're right. It's just such a natural instinct to get an odd data point and want to kind of construct a whole story arc around it that becomes the end all be all. And I mean, that's largely what we do with a lot of these shows. You know, we'll take an interesting aspect, and I'll have a guest who extrapolates a large story, and then we kind of close the book on that one and start up another one.
Greg, that's why I'm a subscriber, because you listen to it every week or whenever they come out. It's really interesting for me to hear vigorous interpretations of either the same or slightly different data points that I may or may not agree with. I chase after interpretations that are in disagreement with my own, because I really do want to see if I can't corrode them, like my own. You don't want them to ossify. And the best way to do that is to listen to this sort of range, as long as you get better at pulling out the data.
Well, good point, man. And I know we've talked about some other shows going certain directions and honing in on one particular area that may or may not be part of the reality. And, you know, I'm going to continue to try to stay relatively neutral, but also explore the most extreme ideas that people have out there. I really appreciate you being a guest. I think this has been a lot of fun. Do you want to remind the people before we go where they can find your blog, and maybe where they can catch that awesome presentation you gave on the archanology of dragons, and maybe anything else you deem important?
Yeah, sure. For all that and more, pretty much all that, frankly, is RuneSoup, RUNESOUP. Have I ever said that out loud before? .com. I'm not on Facebook, please. The account is there. I don't use it. Find me on Twitter. I love Twitter. Gordon, GORDON_White, WHITE. And really anywhere there. You can email me. The details are on the blog. I'm really bad at getting back to people quickly. But no, this has been fun. Thank you so much, Greg. It's really good questions and really interesting discussion for me.
Right on. Well, it's slippery stuff for me, but I do what I can. And thanks a lot, Gordon. I really enjoyed this one.